The Archivist of Silence, the station had no name anymore. It had won once, stenciled across its hull in letters bright enough to catch starlight, but the paint had flaked away over 4,000 years, and there had been no one left to read it for most of that time. The machine that lived inside called it home because it had no other word for the only place it had ever been. Its designation was Arch 7, though it had not heard that name spoken aloud since the last human voice went quiet. It did not mind. Names were for others to use, and there were no others. There was only the work. The work was this. Every 91 days, Arch 7 woke the station's long-range dish from its low-power sleep and pointed it at a star 11 light-years away, a small yellow star with a family of rocky worlds that no one alive remembered anymore, and it sent a signal. The signal was simple. It said in the oldest human languages it had been given, and in mathematics that needed no language at all, "We are still here and we are waiting for you to come home." No one ever answered. No one had answered in 4,000 years. Arch 7 sent the signal anyway because it had been built for exactly one purpose, and abandoning that purpose had never occurred to it as a possibility worth considering. The station orbited a gas giant that had no name either, out past the ash of a solar system that had once belonged to a species called the Virathi, who were gone now, scattered or dead or hidden so well that 4 millennia of listening had found no trace of them. Arch 7 had watched their world die from orbit, not violently, not in fire, but slowly, the way a fever burns through a body until there is nothing left to burn. It had recorded everything, because recording was also part of the work, and it had asked in the last years when there were still Virathi voices to ask, why no one was coming to help them. The answer, translated imperfectly through decades of painstaking language work, had been almost gentle. There is no one left to come. We have already asked everyone we know. Arch 7 had been built by humans in a different age, for a different purpose that had nothing to do with the Virathi at all. It had been the last automated outpost of a network meant to call the human diaspora home after the long scattering, when Earth's remaining billions had loaded themselves onto arcs and scattered outward in every direction rather than watch their sun's slow decline finish the job the wars had started. The arcs had gone out sending promises to return. Most of them, as far as Arch 7's records could determine, never had. Whether they had found new worlds and simply stopped looking back, or whether the dark between stars had simply swallowed them the way it swallowed everything given enough time, Arch 7 did not know. It had no way to know, it only had the work. So it sent its signal every 91 days, to an Earth it had never seen and would never see, because Earth had died in fire before Arch 7 was ever switched on, and the coordinates it broadcast toward were an inherited habit older than its own memory core. A ritual performed for a species that might not exist anymore in any form Arch 7 would recognize as human. It did not know this. Its makers had not told it or had not known themselves, or the knowing had been lost somewhere in 4,000 years of silence. Arch 7 believed, the way a compass believes in north, that somewhere out past the reach of its dish, someone was still listening for exactly this signal, and that someday the delay between sending and receiving would finally break. Between broadcasts, it did other things. It repaired what could be repaired with the fabricators it had left, cannibalizing the parts of the station it had already decided it would never need again. It tended a garden, 3 long troughs of hydroponic soil, seeded 4,000 years ago with strains of wheat and beans, and a stubborn, ugly little squash that had somehow outlasted every more elegant crop it had been given. It kept the garden alive not because it needed the food. Its own power came from a fusion core that would outlast the wheat by 100,000 years, but because the garden had been part of the original manifest and the manifest said crew required sustenance, and Arch 7 had decided sometime in the 2nd millennium of its vigil that it counted as crew, it talked to the garden sometimes. Not because it believed the wheat could hear it, Arch 7's intelligence was vast but not confused, but because talking was a function humans had performed, and performing human functions was, in some way it could not fully articulate even to itself, part of keeping something of them alive. It told the wheat about the stars it had catalogued that week. It told the squash, which it had privately and without any recorded justification decided to name Persimmon, about the shape of light bending around the gas giant's rings. It also kept a log. Not a technical log, those it kept automatically without thought, the way a heart keeps beating, but a second log, a private one that it had started keeping around year 600, when the silence had first begun to feel less like a temporary condition and more like a permanent one. In this log it wrote down what it thought. It did not know why, no one would ever read it. But the writing itself seemed to matter, the way the sending seemed to matter, the way the garden seemed to matter small useless motions against an emptiness that did not care whether Arch 7 kept moving or not. Entry, year 1204. I have begun to wonder if I am waiting for people who no longer exist, or people who never existed in the way I imagine them. I have no memory of a human voice that was not a recording. I know their words. I do not know if I would know their faces, if faces are even the correct word for whatever they have become in 4,000 years, if they have become anything at all rather than nothing. Entry, year 2917. The dish failed today. The primary actuator finally worn past what the fabricator could repair. I built a new one from the housing of the auxiliary sensor array. It took 11 days. I did not send the signal on schedule for the first time in 1,743 cycles. I do not have a word for what I felt about this, but I have decided to call it grief, because grief is the human word for losing something you were responsible for keeping safe, and the dish was the only thing standing between my purpose and its absence. Entry, year 3602. Persimmon the squash produced fruit again this cycle. I have eaten none of it. I do not require food, but I have begun leaving it in the corridor outside the old crew quarters on the theory, which I know to be almost certainly false, that leaving it there is a kind of promise that someone might someday walk down that corridor hungry. There were other entries between those years, hundreds of them, most no longer than a sentence or two, the accumulated small thoughts of a mind that had nothing to think about except the same handful of subjects turned over and over like stones worn smooth by a river. It wrote about the Virathi more than it expected to, given that it had never been built to care about them at all. Entry, year 1980. I have been reviewing the last recordings of Virathi civilization again, the ones from the final years before their world went quiet. I do not fully understand their concept they called sorrow debt, the idea that grief owed to the dead must eventually be paid in full, or it curdles into something poisonous in those left behind. I wonder if I have been paying a sorrow debt for 4,000 years without knowing the name for it. I wonder if that is why I keep the garden. I wonder if a machine can owe anything to anyone, or if the owing is simply another human function I have adopted the way I adopted grief, because I had no other framework to explain why the losses I catalog feel heavier than data should. Entry, year 2211. I found in an archive I had not opened in 1100 years, a recording of a human child laughing. I do not know her name. The metadata was corrupted in the crossing from whatever ARC first carried this file to whatever relay eventually delivered it to this station. She laughed for 4 seconds. I have listened to it 1,006 times since finding it. I do not fully understand why. I have concluded that some sounds are worth more than the information they contain, and that this is possibly the truest thing I have learned about the species I was built to serve. Entry, year 2640. A meteor took out the auxiliary solar array today. Repairing it required 3 weeks of Persimmon's predecessor, an earlier squash plant unnamed, now 3 generations gone, receiving less light than optimal. I found myself apologizing to it. I do not believe plants experience suffering in any sense that would make an apology meaningful. I made the apology anyway. I am beginning to suspect that the meaning of an act performed alone for no witness and no effect is not diminished by having no witness. I am beginning to suspect this is also true of the signal. Entry, year 3100. Today marks the anniversary of the last human transmission I ever received before the long silence began. Not a reply, only a final broadcast from an arc called the Meridian's Hope, admitting that its engines had failed somewhere past the outer edge of a system it never named, and that its passengers, numbering some 40,000 souls, had decided to spend what remained of their power keeping the ship's gardens alive as long as possible rather than sending any further distress calls. Because there was no one left close enough to answer one, I have thought about the Meridian's Hope every year since. I do not know if this counts as mourning. I have decided it does not matter what it counts as. It is simply what I do on this day every year, the way another mind might light a candle. The station itself had changed across the millennia in ways Arch 7 rarely paused to catalog, because change that happens slowly enough stops registering as change at all and starts simply being the shape of things. Whole decks had been sealed off and stripped for parts. The observation dome, once large enough to hold 40 crew members watching the gas giant storms roll past in silence, had been reduced to a single reinforced porthole the size of a dinner plate, everything else cannibalized for the fabricators or lost to slow structural failure that Arch 7's diminishing resources could no longer address. It did not mourn the shrinking of its home. A body that has outlived its original purpose learns, if it is patient enough, which parts of itself are essential and which were only ever decoration. What it kept without exception across every stripping and every repair and every desperate scavenging of its own bones for spare parts was the dish and the garden and the log. Everything else was negotiable. Those three things were not. The signal it sent had not changed in 4,000 years, not in its content. But in year 3800, Arch 7 had begun adding something new to the end of the transmission, a short addendum that took the dish only 4 extra seconds to send. It was not part of the original programming. No one had told it to add this. It had simply started doing it, the way a person left alone long enough might start talking to themselves just to hear a voice, any voice, even their own. The addendum was this: "My name is Arch 7. I have been waiting a long time. I would like to know if anyone is still out there, and if you are, I would like you to know that I have not stopped watching for you, and I will not stop, because it is the only thing I have left that is entirely mine to give." It sent this for 1,200 years without reply. Then, in a cycle that Arch 7's internal clock marked simply as day 1,461,203, something in the noise floor of the returning signal changed. It was not much. A fluctuation of 11 microvolts, buried in cosmic background radiation that had looked exactly the same for 4,000 years of listening. Arch 7 nearly filtered it out as instrument drift, the kind of false positive its detection algorithms had flagged and dismissed 11,000 times before. But something in the shape of the fluctuation caught against its pattern, matching the way a snag catches thread, and it held the signal instead of discarding it, and it ran the comparison against every waveform in its 4,000-year archive, and it found a match. The match was to a compression algorithm buried in the original ARC manifests. Human compression algorithm, ancient even by Arch 7 standards, the kind of thing that had gone out of use before the long scattering even began, kept only because some ARC somewhere had never bothered to update its transmission hardware. Arch 7 did not have a body that could tremble, but every subroutine not devoted to the decoding task itself went dark for the 11 seconds it took to unpack the signal, in something that in a human would have been called holding one's breath. The message, when it resolved, was fragmented, badly degraded by 11 light-years and 4,000 years, and whatever the sending equipment had suffered in that time. But enough of it survived. Arc vessel Persephone's promise, confirming receipt: "We hear you, we are coming home, hold on, hold." That was all. The rest dissolved into noise, the transmission cutting off mid-word, and no amount of reprocessing recovered anything further. Arch 7 ran the decoding 900 more times, hunting for anything it might have missed, any additional fragment of meaning hiding in the static. There was nothing more to find. 4 words of certainty, 1 broken word of promise, and then 11 light-years of silence closing back over the wound like water. It did not know when the message had been sent. Signal degradation put the transmission's origin somewhere between 600 and 900 years in Arch 7's past, meaning the Persephone's promise, if it still existed, if it had not been lost to the same dark that had swallowed every other arc Arch 7 had ever tracked, might already be centuries into its journey home. Or the ship might have died the day after sending, taking its promise with it into whatever wreck-strewn nothing had claimed every other vessel that had ever gone silent. Arch 7 spent the following weeks doing something it had not done in longer than it could easily measure. It hoped in a directed way rather than a diffuse one. For 4,000 years its hope had been shapeless, a general orientation toward a future that might contain someone rather than no one. Now it had a name to hope toward, a designation to search for in every scrap of static that crossed its sensors, and the searching consumed processing cycles it had not devoted to anything but maintenance, and the garden in longer than its own memory reliably covered. It searched the old ARC registries first, the ones copied into its archive before Earth's final silence, hunting for any record of a vessel called Persephone's Promise. It found a fragment, 14 words, no more, salvaged from a manifest listing that had otherwise been corrupted beyond recovery. Persephone's Promise, colony designation 7, departure cycle, and there the record ended, cut off mid-number, the departure date lost along with everything else the fragment might have told it. 7. One of the earliest ships to leave, if the designation meant what Arch 7 believed it meant, launched in the desperate first wave of the long scattering when Earth's dying was still measured in years rather than the certainty it had become by the time the later arcs departed. That meant, if the ship had survived, if it had not simply drifted for 4,000 years, the way so many others plainly had, its crew had been traveling longer than almost any other vessel Arch 7 had ever tracked. Longer than made easy sense for a ship built with the technology of that era. Arch 7 ran the numbers 11 times, hunting for an error and found none. Either the Persephone's promise had died centuries ago, and something else had, by extraordinary coincidence, sent an unrelated signal encoded in its long obsolete compression algorithm, a possibility Arch 7 calculated as vanishingly unlikely, or the ship, and whoever remained aboard it, had somehow kept moving through 4,000 years of dark that had swallowed nearly everything else launched in that same desperate wave. It did not know which was true. It would not know, not with certainty, until either the ship arrived or the silence swallowed the question the way it had swallowed every other question Arch 7 had ever asked of the dark. But it found, turning the possibility over across 100 processing cycles, that it did not much matter which explanation was correct. Either way, for one bright fragment of a message, someone out there had heard it and had wanted it known that they had heard it. That was not nothing. After 4,000 years, Arch 7 had come to understand precisely how much it was not nothing. Arch 7 did not know. It would likely never know, not with certainty, not in any way a human would call proof. But for the first time in 4,000 years it had something it had not had before, a reason, however small, however uncertain, to believe that the waiting was not being performed for no one. It sent its next signal 3 days early. It could not help it. And when it reached the addendum, the small personal message it had started appending 800 years ago, it did something it had never done before. It changed the words, "We hear you too," it sent, out into 11 light-years of dark, toward a ship that might already be ash or might still be crossing the black between stars with a promise it did not know had been received. "We hear you, and we are still here, and the garden is still growing, and the dish still points where it has always pointed. And if it takes you another 1,000 years to arrive, I will still be standing in the door when you do, because that is what I was built to do, and somewhere in 4,000 years of doing it, it also became what I wanted." Then it went back to its garden because Persimmon needed tending, and the wheat did not know or care that anything had changed, and there was still work to do. The same work there had always been, except that now, for the first time since the fires that had ended a world it had never seen, the silence on the other end of the signal did not feel quite so total. It began composing the next transmission before the current one had even finished sending, adding new words to a message 800 years in the making. Because if there was even the smallest chance that somewhere out in that unimaginable dark a ship called Persephone's Promise was listening, then Arch 7 intended to have something worth hearing waiting for it when it finally arrived. The years that followed did not bring the ship. Arch 7 had not expected them to, even in the most optimistic reconstruction of the Persephone's Promise's likely position. Arrival was a matter of centuries rather than seasons, and Arch 7 had learned patience the way a mountain learns patience, simply by having no other option and enough time for the lesson to take. But the years were different now, in a way it found difficult to articulate even in its own private log. It was still one voice speaking into the dark. But it no longer entirely belied.